Camille Watkins was 38 years old when her twin sister called her from a gas station bathroom at 2 in the morning, whispering so her husband wouldn't hear. Camille had not heard her sister Simone cry like that since they were 9 years old, and their father had not come home from the hospital. She sat up in her bed in Charlotte and listened. She listened to every syllable. She did not interrupt. She did not offer comfort too fast, because comfort offered too fast was just another way of not listening. Their father had taught her that. When Simone finally stopped speaking, Camille asked one question. She asked, "How long?" Simone said, 3 years. 3 years of a man named Derek Webb convincing a woman she had no options. 3 years of isolation disguised as protection, of financial control dressed up as provision, of a slow and methodical dismantling of the woman Simone used to be. Derek had married a structural engineer with her own firm and spent 37 months reducing her to someone who flinched at raised voices and kept $40 hidden in the lining of an old coat. He had taken $84,000 from the joint accounts. He had forged Simone's signature on a refinancing agreement. He had kept her passport in his desk drawer and told her it was just easier that way. What Derek Webb did not know, what he could not have imagined, was that Camille Watkins held a federal security clearance, a rank of major in the Army Reserve, and a twin sister's face that was, within 6 careful hours, completely indistinguishable from Simone's. What happened next would cost Derek Webb everything he believed he had already won. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning Camille drove from Charlotte to Memphis, the sky was still gray at the edges, and the highway was half empty in the way it only ever is before 6 in the morning. She had a thermos of black coffee, a duffel bag in the back seat, and a folder on the passenger seat that she had not opened yet because she already knew every page in it by memory. She had spent 11 days preparing. She had not called ahead, not once after that first phone call, because phone calls leave records and she was not interested in leaving records until she was ready to choose which records got made. Her father had told her once, when she was 14 and furious about something she could no longer recall, "The one who prepares owns the moment." He had been a civil engineer for 31 years and had built bridges in 4 states, and he meant it as a lesson about work. But Camille had always understood it as something larger. He had passed in 2019 after a long decline, and she kept the phrase the way some people keep photographs, somewhere accessible, somewhere she returned to when she needed to be reminded of what she was made of. She and Simone had grown up in the same house in Memphis, same bedroom until they were 12, same school until Camille left for West Point. They had the same round face, the same gap between their front teeth that neither of them had ever fixed, the same slight tilt in the way they held their shoulders when they were thinking through something difficult. They had diverged in visible ways. Camille kept her hair short and close. Simone wore hers longer and pressed. But the bones were the same. The voice was the same when Camille made the effort. She thought about the last time she had seen Simone in person, which had been their father's funeral in 2019, and how Derek had stood slightly too close to Simone the entire day, a hand always on her elbow or her shoulder, steering her from conversation to conversation in the way a person steers traffic, which at the time Camille had read as grief management and now read, 3 years later and with better information, as something else entirely. She had not said anything about it because it had not yet formed into language she could justify. She had filed it. She had left it in the drawer where unconfirmed things lived, and she had driven back to Charlotte, and she had returned to her work and her apartment and her routines, and she had called Simone every 2 weeks until the calls started getting shorter and harder to schedule. She had filed that too. Simone had started her firm 7 years ago. She had built it from a subcontracting relationship into a 12-person practice that specialized in load-bearing residential renovation. She had designed and supervised the work on 43 homes. She had 4 pending contracts worth a combined $3 million. She had built something real and specific and hers, and Derek Webb had spent 3 years treating it as an inconvenience he had not yet figured out how to absorb. Camille pulled off the highway and stopped at a rest area. She opened the folder for the first time, not to read it, but to confirm it was still there. All of it. Every page in the right order. Then she closed it, drank the last of the coffee, and drove the remaining 40 miles to the house where her sister was living like a guest in her own home. Simone met her at the back door with the careful look of someone who had learned to assess a room before entering it. She was thinner than Camille remembered. She had a bruise on her left forearm that she had covered with a wide bracelet, and when Camille looked at it and said nothing, Simone looked away and said it was from a cabinet door. Camille did not argue. She set down the duffel bag and said, "Tell me his schedule." Simone told her. Derek left for his office at 8:15 most mornings. He worked in commercial real estate brokerage, medium-sized firm, the kind of position that required a good suit and a confident handshake and not much else. He came home between 6 and 6:30. He had a regular Thursday lunch meeting. He played golf on Saturday mornings if the weather allowed. He kept his passwords in a notebook in the top desk drawer, which he locked, but Simone knew which key it was because she had seen him use it. She also knew that he had a second phone. She had never been able to prove it. She had suspected it for 2 years, had noticed the small depressions in the mattress that didn't match his shape, the calls that went to voicemail when she was standing in the same room, the overnight bag he kept packed and repacked without ever explaining why. Camille listened. She wrote nothing down. She said, "I'm going to need until Thursday." Simone said, "What happens Thursday?" Camille said, "His lunch meeting." They sat at the kitchen table that Simone had picked out herself in the first year of their marriage, back when everything still felt like choosing rather than being told. Simone made tea she didn't drink. Camille looked around the house and read it the way she had been trained to read territory, exits, sight lines, the placement of cameras, the arrangement of furniture that told you who controlled a space. The house was Simone's design on the surface, her taste in the colors and the fixtures, but the layout had been rearranged in ways that put Derek's comfort first in every room that mattered. She thought, he's been renovating her the same way he renovated this house. Slowly, one load-bearing wall at a time. The first thing she needed was the second phone. She found it on Tuesday morning. Derek had left at 8:12, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, which Camille had recorded without commenting on. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when the door closed behind him, and she waited 4 minutes before she stood up. She had learned in the army that 4 minutes was how long impatience took to make a mistake. After 4 minutes, she walked to the home office and stood outside it for a moment, listening to the quality of silence in the house. The lock on the desk drawer was a standard pen tumbler. Simone had told her which key, a small brass one on a ring Derek kept on his nightstand. Camille had been in the bedroom at 6:40 that morning while Derek was in the shower, and she had taken a photograph of the key with her phone, front and back, and sent it to a number in Charlotte. The copy had been waiting for her when she woke up, slipped under the back door in a small envelope. She opened the drawer. The notebook was there. So was a burner phone, powered off, with a San Diego area code on the label of the SIM card visible through the translucent back panel. She did not touch the phone. She photographed it in place. She photographed the notebook open to the page with the passwords. She photographed the desk contents in sequence, numbered in her mind like evidence exhibits. Then she closed the drawer, locked it, and returned the key to the nightstand. Her hands didn't shake. They never had. Not in theater, not in the deposition rooms she'd sat in as a material witness, not in the moments before anything that mattered. She had been asked about this before, and she had thought about it and concluded it was not composure so much as preparation. Things you have already decided about cannot surprise you into trembling. She sat back down at the kitchen table and called the attorney whose name she had been given by a woman she trusted at Fort Bragg, a woman who had needed a Memphis family law attorney 8 years ago and had never forgotten the one who had handled it correctly. The attorney's name was Patricia Odom. She had 17 years of family law in Shelby County and a voice like someone who had heard everything and was still paying attention. Camille described what she had. She described the $84,000 in transfers she had traced through statements Simone had quietly photographed over the past 6 months. She described the forged refinancing signature. She described the passport in the desk drawer. She described the bruise on Simone's forearm, its age, its location, its careful concealment. Patricia Odom was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How quickly can your sister sign a limited power of attorney?" Camille said, "Tonight." Patricia said, "Then Thursday morning, before his lunch, I need everything you have in a format I can work with." Camille said, "I'll have it to you by 7. The last thing she needed was Derek's Thursday lunch meeting. She had found it in his calendar, which she had accessed through the passwords in the notebook on a tablet he left plugged in on the kitchen counter. The meeting was at a restaurant called Broussard's, 12:15. Reservation for 2 under his name. She had looked up the reservation system, found a contact at the restaurant through a former colleague, and confirmed that the second person in the reservation had been a consistent Thursday presence for 11 months. Her name was Kristen Farr. She worked in marketing at Derek's firm. She had a LinkedIn profile with a profile photo and a history of liking Derek's posts going back 18 months. She drove a white Lexus. She had her own apartment across town that Derek had co-signed on without Simone's knowledge, which was how Camille found out that Derek's name was on a lease he had signed with money from the joint account. An account that Simone had built from contracts she had designed and supervised and delivered on time. The money had moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting flags. 11 transfers over 14 months, ranging from $3,200 to $9,800, always on a Friday afternoon when Simone's attention was typically on her Friday site reviews and end-of-week project documentation. Whoever had advised Derek on the methodology had known what they were doing, which told Camille something about the premeditation involved, which told her something about the person she was dealing with, which told her everything she needed to know about how to respond. You didn't outshout a plan like that. You outprepared it. You found every assumption built into it, and you removed them one at a time, quietly, until the whole structure had nothing left to rest on. Camille thought he used her engineering to fund his replacement of her. There was a structural metaphor in that. She chose not to articulate it. Some things you don't say. Some things you simply use. She drove to Patricia Odom's office on Wednesday evening with a flash drive and a folder of printed documents organized in chronological order with exhibit tabs she had cut from cardstock and labeled by hand. Patricia reviewed them across her desk and said nothing for 7 minutes, and then looked up and said, "You served." Camille said, "Yes," Patricia said. "It shows." She began laying out the legal framework. The forged signature on the refinancing was a felony in Tennessee. The $84,000 in transfers from a joint account into a single-party investment account, done incrementally to avoid reporting thresholds, constituted financial fraud and, in combination with the other documented control behaviors, would support a protective order on grounds well beyond the standard. The co-signed lease represented a financial liability Simone had not consented to. The passport retention was itself a form of documented coercion. Real power operated in quiet rooms. This room was quiet. The fluorescent light over Patricia's desk hummed at a frequency Camille associated with late nights and preparation, the sound of work being done correctly and without an audience. Patricia said, "What do you want him to have when this is over?" Camille thought about it. She said, "The lease. He can keep the lease." Patricia almost smiled. On Wednesday evening, after the meeting with Patricia, she went back to the house. Derek came home at 6:22. He set his briefcase by the door, the way he always did, a habit she had learned from Simone the same way she had learned all of his habits, from a careful inventory. He came into the kitchen. She was at the stove, making the pasta dish she had watched Simone make from a photograph on Simone's recipes saved folder. She had her back to him. He said, "Smells good," she said. "Should be ready in 20 minutes." He opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a moment, and she felt him looking at her back while he was pretending to look for something to drink. She did not turn around. She continued stirring. He took a sparkling water and went into the living room and turned on the television. She plated the food without calling him and let him hear the sound of it and come to the table, because she had been told that Simone always called him, and she wanted him unsettled in the small ways before the large way arrived. He ate. He talked about his day in the abbreviated way of a man who had never been particularly curious about anyone else's day. She answered with the phrases she had memorized, the neutral reassurances that Simone had described in the way of a person who has learned to navigate a conversation as a minefield. Camille answered them the way a demining specialist walks, slowly, with complete attention, touching nothing carelessly. He cleared his own plate, which surprised her. She filed it. She had learned not to use prior characterizations as predictors. You worked with what was in front of you. She said good night from the kitchen. He said it back from the hall. She did the dishes with care and thoroughness and listened to the sounds of the house settling in around her. She had asked Simone to go to their cousin Denise's house on Thursday morning, to be somewhere with people who knew her, somewhere she could receive a phone call without performing calm she didn't feel. Simone had asked what would happen, and Camille had said something final. Thursday morning, Camille, dressed in clothing she had brought for the purpose. She pressed her hair the night before, styled it the way Simone wore it. She was careful with the makeup, matching the specific products she had inventoried from Simone's vanity. She wore Simone's coat. She put Simone's reading glasses in the coat pocket, not because she needed them, but because Simone always had them there, and a person's habits are visible in ways they don't always intend. She drove to Broussard's and arrived at 12:05. She sat at the bar and ordered water and watched the door. Derek came in at 12:11, ahead of his reservation, the way a man arrives when he is comfortable and in charge of a space. He was in a gray suit, a good one, the kind of suit that cost what it cost, because it was meant to signal that its wearer had no reason to explain himself. He scanned the room with the practiced ease of someone who always expected to be the most assured person present. He saw Camille at the bar. She watched his expression change. It moved through confusion and settled somewhere between alarm and calculation, and she recognized calculation because she had spent a career watching people recalibrate in real time when the situation shifted under them. He walked to the bar. He said, low and tight, "What are you doing here?" Camille said, "Sit down, Derek." He said, "This isn't, you need to go home." She said, "I'm not Simone." He stopped. She said it again, quietly, in her own voice, which was identical to Simone's but had a register underneath it, something uncompromising, something that had not been reduced. "I'm Camille, her sister. I think you know who I am." He had heard her name. She could see it land. He had never met her, because in 3 years he had made sure Simone's contact with her family was managed and minimized. But he knew her name, and he knew that she had served, and he knew that Simone had given up trying to see her, because it was easier not to fight about it. He sat down. He looked at the door. Kristen Farr was not yet there. Camille set the folder on the bar. She said, "You have about 4 minutes before your lunch guest arrives, so I'll be efficient." She opened the folder. She laid the documents out one at a time, in order the way you present evidence when you want someone to understand not just what they've done, but exactly how thoroughly they've been seen doing it. The bank transfer records. The forged signature on the refinancing, with the forensic document examiner's preliminary assessment clipped to it. The lease agreement with his name on it, signed with funds from a joint account established in 2019. The phone photograph, the burner SIM visible in the case. She said Patricia Odom filed a protective order at 8 this morning. The refinancing will be unwound. The fraudulent transfers are being referred to the Dawes office. The lease is in your name, and you're welcome to it. He said, "You can't. This isn't." Simone agreed to those transfers. Camille said, "She didn't. You know she didn't. The forensic accountant Patricia retained knows she didn't. The signature analysis knows she didn't." He leaned forward and lowered his voice into something that wanted to be menacing. He said, "I will make this very difficult. I will make it go on a long time." He was trying to find something to leverage. She watched him trying. He said, "She's fragile. She's not going to hold up. You don't know what she's actually like." Camille looked at him for a moment without speaking. She had been in rooms with men who used other people's fragility as a weapon, and she had learned something about that over many years. Fragility, when it exists, was always something someone else had worked to create. You did not get credit for the wound you inflicted, and then point to the wound as evidence of weakness. She said nothing about any of this. She let him watch her face and find nothing useful in it. He shifted. He said, "She's been struggling for years. This isn't something I did. She's always needed," she said. "Derek." He stopped. She said, "I know what the forensic accountant found. I know what the document examiner found. I know what the bank records show, and I know when each transfer was made, and I know what the co-signed lease costs monthly. And I know that the deposit was drawn from the joint account on a Friday in March when Simone was on a job site in Germantown managing a $340,000 renovation. I know exactly who did what and when. So does Patricia Odom. So does the Shelby County Dawes office as of this morning. You can make this longer, or you can make this quieter. Those are your options now." From the door of the restaurant, a man in a dark coat stepped inside and looked toward the bar. He was one of Patricia's associates. There only to be visible, there only to let Derek understand that Camille had not come alone. Derek looked at him. He looked back at the documents. His jaw tightened, and his hands, she noticed, had flattened on the bar top in the way hands do when a body is trying not to do something visible with them. She said, "You spent 3 years building a case against a woman you underestimated. The problem is that she had an engineer in the family too. We build things differently. We build for load. We build for duration. We build for what happens when something tries to take the structure apart." She gathered the documents. She stood. She said, "You had a good lunch reservation. I'd reschedule it. She picked up the folder and walked out. The door closed behind her with the ordinary sound of a door, which was the right sound for what had just happened. Because what had just happened was not extraordinary. It was simply the completion of work she had started 11 days ago and done correctly. 8 months passed the way honest time passes when a person is no longer using energy to hold a shape they were never meant to hold. Simone's firm took on 2 new contracts in the spring. One of them a public sector renovation project worth $890,000. She hired a third project manager and moved the office from the second bedroom into a real suite on Poplar Avenue, with her name on the door in the kind of lettering that meant she had stopped apologizing for taking up space. She moved into an apartment she chose herself, all the way down to the grout color in the bathroom tile, and she planted a container garden on the balcony with tomatoes and basil, and one Japanese maple that she knew perfectly well was too big for a container, and was growing it anyway. She called Camille on a Tuesday evening in September and talked for an hour about nothing in particular, the way you do when the weight has shifted and conversation is no longer a survival tool, but just a pleasure. She mentioned a man named Calvin, a quiet civil engineer she had met at a professional association dinner in July, who asked careful questions and had not once told her what she should be doing with her firm. She said his name carefully. Camille didn't make a thing of it. She just listened. Derek Webb had lost his license with the State Real Estate Commission following the fraud referral. His firm had let him go in February, quietly, in the way institutional bodies do when they need to manage a liability without advertising it. Kristen Farr had transferred to a regional office in Dallas 3 months after the Broussard's lunch, a detail Simone heard from a mutual acquaintance and registered with no particular emotion. Derek was living in the apartment whose lease he had signed with Simone's money, which he was now paying for himself on a contractor's income that did not cover what his life had cost in full. His mother had stopped answering his calls in March. His former best friend, a man who had stood at his wedding and handed him the ring, had sent him a single text in April that said only, "You lied to all of us." There had been no response to make. Simone didn't know any of this in a way that required her to hold it. She heard pieces of it, the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in, and she noted it and put it down. On an October morning, she was on her balcony with coffee, the maple's leaves just starting to consider red, the tomatoes finally done for the season, the city below her doing its ordinary work in the early light. She had a site visit at 9. She had a call with a contractor at 11. She had her own name on a door on Poplar Avenue and a firm that was hers in every document that had ever described it. She pressed the coffee cup between both palms the way her father had always held his, fingers wrapped around the warmth of it, and she sat with the morning a little longer than she had to. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.